Los Angeles, August 27th, 1965, 11:47 p.m. Elvis Presley's Bel Air mansion. The living room had gone completely silent. Paul McCartney stood frozen near the doorway. Hand on the doorknob, ready to leave, John Lennon sat on the couch, staring at the floor. George Harrison and Ringo Starr exchanged uncomfortable glances. Elvis was standing by the fireplace, glass of Coca-Cola in his hand. He had just said something that nobody expected, something that would haunt the Beatles for the rest of their lives. "What did you just say?" Paul asked, his voice barely a whisper. Elvis looked directly at him with that famous half-smile. But this time, there was something else in his eyes. Something cold, something final. "You heard me, kid." Elvis said quietly, "Rock and roll is dead, and you four killed it." This is the story of the night. The Beatles met Elvis Presley in the meeting that was supposed to be the greatest moment in music history, and became the most uncomfortable encounter any of them would ever experience. And what Elvis whispered to Paul McCartney that night remained a secret for 50 years, until Paul finally revealed it in 2015. The story begins 6 months earlier, February 1965. The Beatles had just conquered America. For the second time, they were the biggest band in the world. Bigger than anyone had ever been, even bigger than Elvis Presley at his peak. The numbers were staggering. They had the top 5 songs on the Billboard Hot 100 simultaneously, something that had never been done before. They were selling out stadiums in minutes. They were on every magazine cover, every TV show, every radio station. They were unstoppable. But there was one person they still idolized, one person they desperately wanted approval from: Elvis Presley, the man who started it all. Without Elvis, John Lennon once said, there would be no Beatles. They had grown up listening to his records, studying his moves, worshiping him from across the ocean. And now in 1965, they were in America, his territory. And they wanted to meet their hero, but Elvis wasn't interested at first, according to Colonel Tom Parker. Elvis's manager, Elvis, had watched the Beatles rise with a mixture of pride and something darker, jealousy. When asked about the Beatles in interviews, Elvis would give polite, generic answers. "Oh, they're talented boys, good musicians, nice fellas." But people close to him said something different. Priscilla Presley later revealed that Elvis would turn off the TV when the Beatles came on. "He doesn't want to watch them," she told friends. "He says they're taking something from him." Taking what she was asked. She didn't answer, but everyone knew the spotlight, the crown, the title of king. For months, the Beatles tried to arrange a meeting through official channels. They had their manager, Brian Epstein, reach out to Colonel Parker. "We would love to pay our respects to Elvis." Brian wrote in a formal letter, the boys consider him the greatest influence on their music. Colonel Parker's response was cold and calculated. "Mr. Presley is very busy with his film. Schedule perhaps when he has time." But weeks went by then. Months, no meeting, no invitation, nothing. John Lennon started to get angry. "He doesn't want to meet us." John said to Paul, "He thinks we're trying to replace him." Paul disagreed. "Maybe he's just really busy." John shook his head. "No one's that busy. He's avoiding us then." In August, everything changed. Elvis was filming a movie in Hollywood and living temporarily in a rented mansion in Bel Air, 565 Perugia Way, a massive estate hidden behind gates and walls. One night after a recording session at Capitol Records, the Beatles were having dinner when their road manager, Neil Aspinall, came running in. He had news. "I just got a call," he said, breathing hard. "Elvis wants to meet you tonight." And the room exploded with excitement. Ringo jumped up. George smiled wide. Paul looked shocked, but John Lennon didn't move. He just stared at Neil with a suspicious look. "Tonight," John said. "Why tonight? Why, after all these months of ignoring us, does he suddenly want to meet tonight?" Neil shrugged. "I don't know, but Colonel Parker said if you want to meet Elvis, it has to be tonight or never." The ultimatum was clear. This was a power move. Elvis was setting the terms. Elvis was in control. They had 2 hours to get ready. At 10 p.m., a convoy of cars pulled up to 565 Perugia Way. Security was everywhere. Men in dark suits, earpieces, stone faces, the Beatles were led through the front door into a massive living room. And there he was. Elvis Presley sitting on a couch in the center of the room, surrounded by what they would later learn was called the Memphis Mafia, his entourage of yes-men, bodyguards, and childhood friends who never left his side. Elvis was wearing a red shirt, black pants, and holding a bass guitar. He didn't stand up when they entered. He didn't smile, he just nodded. Well. He said, "Finally, meet the Beatles." The way he said it wasn't friendly, it was testing them. Paul stepped forward first, trying to be diplomatic. "Mr. Presley, it's an honor we've wanted to meet you for, so." Long Elvis cut him off. "Call me Elvis. Mr. Presley is my father." Awkward silence. John Lennon sat down uninvited. "So, Elvis," he said, "you gonna play that bass or just hold it for decoration?" The room tensed. Elvis's guys shifted uncomfortably, but Elvis smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. "I was about to ask you the same thing," he said. "Heard you boys play some interesting music these days." He emphasized the word interesting, like it was an insult. George tried to lighten the mood. "We grew up listening to your records. Elvis, Heartbreak, Hotel, Hound Dog. Those songs changed our lives." Elvis nodded slowly. Put down the bass guitar, picked up an acoustic. "That's the problem," he said. "You grew up on my music now. You're here in my country playing my music, but calling it yours." Ringo jumped in. "We never said. We invented rock and roll, Elvis. We always said you did." Elvis stood up, walked to the fireplace, his back to them for a long moment, and then he turned around. And what he said next shocked everyone in that room. "See, that's where—" "You're wrong, boys." Elvis said, his voice harder now. "You did say you invented it. Maybe not with words, but with actions. You came to America, you took our music, our sound, our style, and you sold it back to us like it was something new, something British, something better. And America bought it, hook, line, and sinker." Paul tried to defend themselves. "Elvis, we never meant that's not what we—" Elvis raised his hand. "Silence. I've been doing this for 10 years. He continued. 10 years of being called a vulgar degenerate, a threat to American youth. 10 years of being banned from radio stations, censored on TV, told I'm too dangerous, too sexual, too black for white audiences. I fought for every inch of respect I have, and just when I finally get to make movies, get to be taken seriously as an artist, you four show up with your mop-top haircuts and your suits, and suddenly rock and roll is acceptable. Suddenly it's art. Suddenly parents love it, because it's British, because it's safe." The room was dead silent. John Lennon's face was red. "We're not trying to replace you." John said, "We respect what you did." Elvis laughed, but it was bitter. Elvis looked directly at John. "Respect," he said. "You know what? Respect looks like, John, it looks like waiting your turn. It looks like learning the craft, paying your dues, not flying into a country, riding a wave of hype, and acting like you own the place." John stood up, his face inches from Elvis's. "You're jealous." Elvis said it simply like a fact. "You're jealous that we're selling more records than you, that we're bigger than you ever were, and it's eating you alive." For 5 seconds, nobody moved, nobody breathed, and then Elvis did something unexpected. He smiled a real smile, not cold, not bitter, but sad. "You're right," he said quietly. "I am jealous." He walked back to the couch, sat down heavily. The fight seemed to drain out of him. "I've been jealous since I heard I want to hold your hand," he continued, "because I knew right then that everything had changed. I'm 30 years old and I'm already being called has been a relic of the 50s, the old generation. My movies are fluff, my music is being called outdated, and you four. You're the future." The bitterness was gone, now replaced by something more painful. "Truth." Paul sat down across from Elvis. "Mr. Elvis. I mean, Elvis," he corrected himself. "We didn't come here to take anything from you. We came here because without you, there would be no us. You opened the door, we just walked through it." Elvis looked at Paul, really studied him. Then he leaned forward and whispered something so quietly that only Paul could hear. Paul's face went pale. George noticed. "Are you all right, Paul?" Paul nodded, but he looked shaken. "What did he say?" George asked. Paul shook his head. "Nothing. It's nothing, but—" "It wasn't nothing. Decades later, in a 2015 interview, Paul McCartney finally revealed what Elvis whispered to him that night. The interviewer asked Paul, "You've never talked about what Elvis said to you privately that night in 1965. What did he say? Paul was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Elvis told me the saddest thing I've ever heard. He said, 'Paul, enjoy it while it lasts, because one day you'll be sitting where I am, watching someone younger take it all away from you, and you'll realize that fame isn't something you own. It's something you borrow, and the bill always comes due.'" Paul's eyes were wet as he remembered I was 23 years old. He continued, "I didn't understand what he meant. I thought he was just bitter. But now I'm 73. I've watched the world move on. I've seen new bands, new sounds. I've become the legend, the old guy that has been. And I finally understand what Elvis was trying to tell me. He wasn't warning me about losing fame. He was warning me about losing myself to it." Back in 1965, after that whispered conversation, the tension in the room had shifted. It was no longer hostile. It was melancholy. John tried to break the mood. "Look, Elvis," he said, "we can sit here and fight about who owns what, or we can just play some music." Elvis looked up, smiled a real smile for the first time. That night, "Now That I Can Do," he picked up the acoustic guitar, started playing. "That's All Right." Mama, his first hit from 1954. George grabbed another guitar, joined in. Ringo found some bongos, started keeping rhythm. Paul picked up the bass Elvis had been holding earlier, and John just sat back watching for the next 2 hours. They played everything: Hound Dog Blues, Suede Shoes, Chuck Berry songs, Little Richard songs, Beatles songs, Elvis songs. They laughed, they harmonized, they forgot about competition and jealousy and crowds for 2 hours. They were just musicians playing music for the love of it at 2 a.m. It was time to go. The Beatles stood at the door. Elvis walked them out, shook each of their hands. When he got to Paul, he held his hand a little longer. "Remember what I said?" Paul nodded, "I will," as they drove away. John asked, "What did he say to you?" Paul looked out the window at the Los Angeles lights. He said, "He told me to stay human, stay humble, because the moment you start believing you're bigger, then the music leaves you." John was quiet, then he said, "He's right. You know, we're not bigger than Jesus. We're not bigger than anything. We're just 4 guys who got really, really lucky." Paul nodded. "I think Elvis forgot that somewhere along the way. And I think he was trying to make sure we didn't." The meeting was kept relatively quiet. The press reported it as a friendly jam session, a meeting of legends. But those who were there knew the truth. It was a changing of the guard, a torch being passed, but not willingly. Elvis continued making movies through the rest of the 60s. His music became less relevant. His films became jokes. The comeback special in 1968 would briefly restore his crown. But by then, the Beatles had already become the biggest band in history. They broke up in 1970. Elvis died in 1977. But before he died, he and Paul exchanged letters. They never met again. But they understood each other in 1977. When news of Elvis's death reached Paul, he was recording in Scotland. He stopped the session, went outside, and cried. A reporter asked him, "Why are you crying? You only met him once." Paul wiped his eyes, "Because he tried to warn me, and I didn't listen. He told me fame would cost me everything." And he was right. I lost John. I lost George. The band fell apart, marriages failed. And through it all, I kept hearing Elvis's voice, "Enjoy it while it lasts." In 2015, when Paul finally told the full story of that night, he ended the interview with this: "Elvis Presley taught me the most important lesson any artist can learn." He said, "It's not about being the biggest or the best or the most famous. It's about remembering why you started in the first place, because you love the music, and if you forget that, if you let the fame and the money and the ego take over, you become a prisoner of your own success." Elvis became that prisoner. And he spent the last 10 years of his life trying to escape, but he couldn't because he forgot how to just be Elvis, the kid from Tupelo who loved to sing. So when people ask me, what it was like to meet Elvis. I tell them it was like looking into a mirror from the future and seeing what I could become if I wasn't careful. And I've spent the last 50 years trying not to become that. This story remained hidden because the Beatles didn't want to disrespect Elvis. They didn't want the world to know that their hero was broken, jealous, bitter. But now that most of them are gone, now that enough time has passed, the truth can be told. Not to diminish Elvis, but to honor him, to show that even the king was human. Even the king struggled. Even the king was afraid of being forgotten. And maybe that's the real lesson of that night in Bel Air in 1965. Legends aren't born, they're made, and they're fragile. And they need the same thing. We all need to be remembered, not for their fame, but for their humanity. Elvis Presley and the Beatles, two forces that changed music forever, and one uncomfortable night where they learned they weren't so different. After all, this has been another untold story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe for more hidden histories of rock and roll's greatest icons. And remember, the music is bigger than any of us. And the moment we forget that we've already lost, thanks for watching.